So in the previous lesson, we introduced the describe and it functions. The describe function is used to create a category or header for a bunch of related tests, and the it function creates the actual test itself. But within our two tests that we have right here, adds numbers and subtracts numbers, we don't actually have any assertions. We don't have any kind of validation logic. So let's go ahead and do that in this lesson. So right here, I'm once again going to expand the actual body of the arrow function because Prettier collapsed it when we saved. And the next function that I want to introduce you to from Jest is called expect. So I'm going to take expect and I'm going to invoke it. So expect is intended to be invoked within an actual test. That means within the body of the function that we pass as the second argument to the it function. So you don't want to ever use expect outside of a test. It must always be nested within an it function call, more specifically within the function that we pass as the second argument to the it function call. So what we pass to expect is the actual logic or the actual operation that we're going to be running. So for example, if we're testing that invoking a function produces the correct return value, here is where we would actually invoke that function, right? Here is where we would do something like create the instance of the class or invoke the function. Whatever is the thing that we are testing, right? Whatever is the logic that we need to perform as it is written in our program, this is where we write it. So as a very simple example, what I'm going to do is write 1 plus 1. We can consider this to be our basic, super simple and dumb JavaScript program. We're telling JavaScript what it needs to evaluate within that argument to expect, what it needs to run, right? And then what we're going to do, of course, is tell JavaScript what that result should be equal to, right? So within expect is where we put our program logic. So what I want to do here is I want to console log what this function returns, and then we're actually going to run our test suite so we can see this console log for the first time. So I'm going to save this file, and then we need a terminal of some sort, and I can always navigate back to the terminal on my computer. But we also can open up the terminal that is built into VS Code. So right here, I'm going to go to my top menu bar and select Terminal, New Terminal. And so right here, we're going to have a perfect terminal available in VS Code, and it's going to launch us directly into the user form directory, or in other words, the project that we are currently inside of. So we actually have a test command already set up in our project. I can show you that if I open up package.json, we have in the script section a special test command. That means that we can run npm run test in order to run our test suite, but there's also an available shortcut because this is such a common script, and that is simply npm test. So I'm going to run that command, and we should see the console log. So going back to our app.test.js, as I scroll up, we're going to see the output of that expect function call. And you can see it's this very large object that has a whole bunch of methods available on it, like toBe, to be close to be falsy. So these are the actual assertions. These are the actual validations. Each one of these methods checks for something specific, right? There's even a method to check for things like, is it nan, right? To be nan, to be null, to be truthy, to be undefined, to contain, which is going to check for whether the thing that is returned contains something. So you can, for example, validate that an array contains an element at some point, right, within it, right? So in this case, if we want to do a basic equality check, what we're looking for is the toBe method right here. This thing is also called a matcher, so we might say the toBe matcher or the toBe method. So we know that this method is available on the object that expect returns. So right here, I'm going to remove my console log, and on that returned object, we know there is a toBe method, which is going to check for equality. So here, I'm going to invoke that toBe method, and I'm going to pass in what the result should be, right? This is me as a developer saying, JavaScript, I know what the final product or outcome should be. Please validate that it's this. So we're telling JavaScript, run this thing and make sure it's equal to this. So here I'm going to put, for example, the value 2, save that. You'll notice our test suite automatically reruns. That's because the Jest program is running in what's called watch mode. Watch mode means that whenever our files change, Jest will automatically rerun those files that have changed. And what we see here on the screen is what a passing test suite looks like. So you can see we have the pass keyword next to our test file, And if we have multiple test files, we're going to see all of them listed right here in the terminal. Then we have the parent level category based on the string that we passed to describe. So you can see we passed mathematical operations to describe right here. So that's what we see written right here. Then under each one of those categories or headers, we have the individual tests, and we're going to have a check mark if that test passed and an X or a cross if that test failed. Now in this case, our first test adds numbers is passing, so we are getting the check mark. And the reason our second test is passing, subtracts numbers, is because there's nothing actually written inside of it, so there's nothing failing, there's nothing going wrong. So Jess says, I'm going to consider that a failure until I see something wrong. So that is what a passing test looks like. But of course, let's take a look at the inverse, which is going to be a lot more common when we're writing our own code. Let's see what happens if I accidentally put something like a 3 here. If I save this, we're now going to get a different output. You'll notice right here we have a fail next to the test name. So that tells us something in this test file of app.test.js has gone wrong. It's not what it's expected to be. Next to the specific test called adds numbers, we're going to see that X that says this one did not perform as expected. The assertion or the validation that you told me to assert did not prove valid, did not prove correct. And here it's going to say for each test that's failing, going to give you a little bit of information about what just happened. So it's going to say, hey, I expected the value 3, which is coming from what we told it should expect, but it's telling us that it received the value 2. So what it's going to output for this received category is what it actually evaluated within that expect function call. So it evaluated 1 plus 1 to be 2, so it received 2, but it's telling us, hey, I expected this to be 3 because that's what you told me. Then, of course, it's going to show you the line number and the actual place in your test suite that's triggering this error. And of course, that can be super helpful if you have, for example, 50 tests in the exact same file. It's going to show you the line number and the actual assertion that you have that triggered that error. You are welcome to have multiple assertions within a single test. So for example, if I correct this back to 2, I can create as many of these expects as I want within the exact same test. So for example, here I can do 2 plus 3 is going to be equal to 5. And let's say 10 plus 4 is going to be 14. And all of them are going to run. And if one of them fails, for example, let's break up this one in the middle, then the benefit of that is Jest is going to show us the exact line number and the exact assertion, the exact expect function call that triggered that error. Keep in mind, in a situation like this, if we have a failure, for example, on line number 4, Jest is never going to actually evaluate line number 5, so we won't know until this line runs whether this test is actually valid. So it doesn't mean that line 5 is guaranteed to pass. What it means is that Jest ran into an error right here on line 4, and it's saying, I did not find this to be valid, so I'm stopping this test and deeming it a failure. With that said, a very common piece of advice you're going to hear is that it's generally a good idea to have just one expect within your larger test, within your larger it function. And the reason is one expect is kind of a visual indicator and a logical indicator that you're testing exactly one thing and one thing only. If your test has a lot of expects, it probably means that you're trying to test too much, and it's better to break that test up into multiple tests. So simply write more it function calls and be more descriptive in each one on exactly what it is that you're testing, right? So in this case, we actually are testing pretty much duplicate logic in our case, right? We're testing JavaScript's addition functionality, and just one example, for example, line number 3 should be enough to validate that that is logical and correct, right? So no matter whether we're testing JavaScript arithmetic or React components, the same sentiment applies. Your it should describe kind of one isolated detail or thing that you are testing, and you should ideally have one expect function call because that should be the assertion that you make to validate that one thing. That is not a technical requirement, and there's going to be plenty of violations of that in the real world. In fact, I have had many of those violations myself. So I'm not going to say it's a rule that you have to follow 100% of the time. It's just a general best principle to follow as you're testing. So with that said, I can remove these 2 tests, and we can just practice the syntax one more time for our second test. So once again, we're going to have an it function call. The first argument is a string with a description of what we're testing. And then we have a function, and in the body of that function is where we write our assertions. What is an assertion? It's an expectation. It's a validation. It's something that confirms that what we expected to happen did happen. So once again, we do expect. Then in here, we do our program logic, whatever that can be. It can be any JavaScript expression in here. We can invoke a function. We could invoke a method on an object. We can instantiate a class. It doesn't matter. This is where we perform our program logic. So typically, this is where we're going to be using whatever we import into our test file from the main file, right? For example, if we were testing our app component in here, this is where we would be instantiating or rendering that app component. So whatever we do in here, in this case, I'm just going to do 7 minus 5 since we're testing subtraction, that's going to return that object. And that object is going to have a whole bunch of methods, each one representing a different assertion or validation, basically something that you can test. For strict equality, as we learned about in this lesson, we can use the toBe method. And right here, I'm once again going to pass in an argument of 2, and we can see the test automatically reruns upon saving and tells us that that assertion is correct. All right, so toBe is a matcher for strict equality, but there are, of course, many other matchers that we're going to explore throughout the section, including matchers that are specifically related to components and the DOM. Remember, Jest originated as a basic vanilla JavaScript testing library, so it starts with these fundamentals of testing for equality, inequality, nans, nans, undefined, null values, truthy, falsy, kind of those core JavaScript constructs. But then React Testing Library adds on a whole bunch of additional assertions that are going to be available on that object returned from the expect function that test specific things related to the DOM, to what the user sees, etc. All right, but that's the basic syntax. We have describe, we provide a category for what we're testing, we write a test with the it function call, then within that arrow function that we pass to it, we write one or more expectations using the expect function and the corresponding methods or matchers that are available on the method or on the object returned by the expect function. Remember, don't use the expect function outside of a test, so it must always be within an it function call. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.